A warm welcome to this wonderful audience. Good evening, and thank you for coming here in such large numbers. A big shout out to the Bombay Walas and the Pune Walas in this group. I think you're here in for a treat. Trust me, it's been entertaining just sitting backstage and listening to these wonderful gentlemen here. And to the other city Walas, I think you all are going to enjoy the ride as well. Because we have in our midst two amazing storytellers. They tell it as it should be told. They both write with unabashed honesty, no frills, no disclaimers, no shortcuts. And both their new books are a reminder of their craft, but also of their commitment to their favorite cities and their characters. I think their characters, whether it's quirky, whether it's the good, the bad, and the ugly, it's all there. Now that I've whetted your appetite, I'm not going to eat into too much of time because being a daily newspaper journalist, deadlines are sacrosanct. And let's move over to listening to these two wonderful storytellers, the unplugged version. My first question is to both of you. Both your books actually read like love letters, they're like love songs, and to the original versions of your cities. That's the fascinating part of it. So, as authors, we all, I'm sure whoever is here in the audience as well, we tend to find our stories in the things that we love, the things that we experience, and the things that we're able to relate to. So, coming to the two cities that both of you have written about, Bombay and Pune, what are the extraordinary qualities that you found inspiring in your cities that made you all write it in the guise of fiction?
Let me start by saying, is that on?
Yes, it's no, you'll have to.
Yeah. Let me start by saying I was born and brought up in Pune and lived there through school and college. And yeah. Let me start by saying I was born and brought up in Pune, went to Bishop School, Pune, went to Vadya College, one of the Chalu colleges of Pune, and not Ferguson College, which was very studious. But of course, I made friends right through my childhood and my teens. And of course, I knew the city extremely well. From playing truant from school and going to this, see Janak Janak Payal Bhaje or whatever other movie was running on. And I got to know the ins and outs of the city, but when I got down to writing it, it was my fourth book. It was called Pune Company. And it wasn't about the city or at all. It was about my neighborhood. And my neighborhood, and the people, of remarkable characters who I had noticed and observed and made up stories about or changed their names. For instance, there was a Parsi shorthand teacher who used to run an institute of shorthand technology. And she was called Temi Kerawala. But when I fictionalized her, I called her Pepsi Cola. So, because one had to disguise it because they were still alive, some of them. There was a guy who was a bookie at the street corner. It was called Sarbat Wala Chowk. And I suppose somebody used to sell sharbat there, but I don't know why it was called that. It had two Irani restaurants called the Kayani and the Sachapir. And of course, my entire book was about the characters who hung around there. The bookie who was called Soli Kolmi. I mean, his name wasn't Kolmi, but Kolmi means prawn, and he was bent because he'd broken his back. And so he was always known as Soli Kolmi. There was another guy who used to carry dead bodies and big loads from the Parsi temple, and he had long hair, so he was called Samson. And I never knew what his real name was, right? But I wrote about all those characters, the people I knew. So it wasn't autobiographical, but it was very local to Sachapi Street, Synagogue Street, and of course, school in the cantonment and so on. That's where, that's the locality that I had an experience of and felt inspired by. That's why Pune then.
And Murzban?
So, Fiona, it's really so easy to fall in love with the city. The other day, I was reading this book by this gentleman called Firoz Malbari, who's written on the making of Mumbai. And there was a very interesting story that when the city of Bombay, as it was called then, was to be handed over to the English from the Portuguese. You know, it was a dowry. It was a dowry gift to Charles II from Catherine of Braganza. And when the Portuguese fleet, I'm sorry, the English fleet landed up to claim possession of Bombay, the Viceroy of Portugal refused to hand it over, and he actually wrote a letter to the King of Portugal saying that we can't possibly give up Bombay because the day we give up Bombay, we are going to lose India, and Bombay is a better port than even Lisbon. So he actually held out, and for 5 to 6 months, the English fleet was just waiting to take possession of it. So I found that very interesting that someone could get so attached to Bombay as it was then called. Then 10 years later, it was taken over by a Englishman called Sir Gerald Aungier, who was the founder, who's actually known as a founder of Bombay. And he declared that this was a city which by God's assistance shall be built. And there was a conscious attempt to involve various traders from Surat and make life easy for them. So having said that, my own trajectory began when I started writing short fiction. And at that point, my relationship with the city was very ambivalent. I had an enormous love for its sense of history and heritage. And at the same time, I was full of despair for the kind of circumstantial challenges that the city delivered to us, the traffic, the poor quality of air, whatnot. So, and when I started writing, I asked myself some hard-nosed questions that why do we need another Bombay-based writer? I mean, all the great Bombay books had been written by then. There was Rushdie's Murzban Shroff and Midnight's Children. There was Mystery had done Fine Balance. Vikram had come up with Love and Longing in Bombay. And Suketu, of course, had done Maximum City. So I was having this certain sense of disenchantment with my work that, why do we, what did I have to say which was any different? And then I looked around and I said that, I actually had no business to write about Bombay because I was a South Bombay guy and I was very stunted in my whole understanding of how the other half lived. So at that point, I read something very interesting about how Steinbeck had written The Grapes of Wrath. And it seemed that Steinbeck first wrote it as a satire, and then when he actually went into the labor camps, he discovered that the situation was quite different, so he got rid of his whatever work he'd done, and he rewrote The Grapes of Wrath. And so that led to some kind of awakening in me, and I started journeying to the villages of India and understanding migration patterns into the city. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I came back with a completely different sensibility, and I started spending a lot of time with migrant communities like Dhobis, Victoriawalas, Malishwalas. It was a kind of a deconditioning of my whole South Bombay origins. And so I would go to the Dhobi Ghat and I would land up early morning, sit on the charpoi and say, chalo, Gana sunao, And I started understanding what were the issues that owned them, what were the issues that they were afflicted with. Similarly with Victoriawalas, Malishwalas, Taxiwalas. And that's when once I got sensitized to that, I think that made a difference to my writing. My short fiction started getting acceptance in the US. My stories started getting published. I got in some awards called the Pushcart Prizes. And I think that led to my whole sensitization. Then with my next book, which was Waiting for Jonathan Koshi, I could actually celebrate the multicultural roots of the city, its genealogy. So I had these 5 friends who were into alternate thought. And they were trying to hold out against the rampant development that was happening to Bandra. So, then when I'm moving on to Muses over Mumbai, which is my next forthcoming book, I started with an exhortation which says, call it Bombay or call it Mumbai, my city remains the story capital of the world. There are no limits to the inspiration it delivers, no end to its generosity. And by that time, I think I was completely in love with Bombay. And the city started speaking back to me and giving me stories.
So we can expect more love letters also from you.
Sorry?
We can expect more love letters from you about the city in the coming years.
With a little bit of steam against the custodians of the city,
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
There's a question coming up on that. So now that the Bombay Wala has spoken about his inspiration, Farrukh, my next question is to you. You write in your newest book, The Deccan Queen, Take Two, that it's a connection. You call the train a connection between two worlds, Bombay and Pune. One is a sleepy, quiet plateau town, and the other is a bustling coastal city. You also talk about how back in the day, young boys used to refer to it as a get out of jail card, right? Not anymore. I mean, things have changed. So, according to you, what are those changes that you see happening to your beloved Pune each time you come back?
Well, since you started with Deccan Queen, I can tell you that Deccan Queen was our outlet to Bombay. We lived in a quiet, what what would be called a university town. It was a kind of Oxford at the time, because the world in which we lived in school and in college, we knew each other from the different educational institutions. We used to play, mess about with hockey together. Dilip Padgaonkar was in a different college, but a great friend, and it was quiet and it was active insofar as you could meet all the time in Pune. So every day I met the same boys and girls, and we went to the same cafe and drank the same uh, single chai. But Bombay was quite different. Bombay, you went to Bombay to meet your cousins, or when I was 4 years old, to meet my grandfather, who used to take us to Rani Bagh because he lived round the corner from there, in Baikala, in Dhondy Terrace, in fact. And he used to take four of us cousins, my sister, to the Victoria Gardens, as it was then called, the zoo. And Bombay became an intrigue. And it was different then, because we used to take a bus. I think it was called the A1, not the AI. It was called the A1 then. We used to go to Juhu from Baikala, and Juhu was a picnic place. We used to sit there all day and come back on the bus in the evening, because it was the countryside. It wasn't what it is today. And so Bombay became, as the years passed very quickly, extremely intriguing as a city. I used to spend time uh, with my cousins who lived in Bombay. And so I'd go for the holidays, I'd go for 4 or 5 weeks, stay in Bombay, stay with my uncles, aunts, all sorts of people lived in Bombay at that time. But it was a complete bustle of a city. It was a metropolis. And when I say get out of say, jail card, it was like coming from an isolated place into, into a completely new and very, very busy and very, very dangerous and intriguing world. So that's what happened at the time. And Deccan Queen, well, you go in the morning and come back in the evening, or go in the morning, stay, and then come back a later evening on the Deccan Queen. And it was the connection, the link between these two experiences, these two worlds in which we lived.
And what about Pune itself? Do you
Ah,
go back to Pune and do you
Pune,
see the
yes,
change there? What's
I
your take on it?
today I can't recognize Pune at all. It began in the late 50s, early 60s with a penicillin factory in Pimpri, and that's a suburb of Pune. And we thought, oh dear, industrialization is turning up. But I mean, it was very, very slight, the industrialization. All these places, Ganeshkind, Kharki, Shivaji, they were remote places, but still part of the town. Today, when you go there, you, it's just it's like Bangalore or Bombay. It's got not only industrialized, it's become a suburb, in fact, of this city. And the bustle and the buildings and whatnot, and just the crowds, the traffic, it's something I just don't recognize. The only thing is, last year I took some friends of mine from England to Pune to look it over. So we went to my school, we went to my college, and then I said, I'll show you where my house used to be. It's been demolished, and there's a big house built there now, big 10-story or 8-story, whatever. But next to the 8-story house was still Temi Kerawala's bungalow, and Dara Kama's house opposite, right? Again, with tiled roofs and canvas ceilings inside the house and so on. There's still those buildings remain in that particular locality of Pune. So it's fascinating in that way. But next to it is high rises and skyscrapers.
Let's hope those few remnants somehow survive and are still there the next time when you come also to Pune. Let's hope those places are still there, I think.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting that you share this, Farrukh, because so the relationship you had with Bombay, where you would come here to meet your relatives, I had a similar kind of relationship at Pune in the 70s. And I was all of 12, 13 in the late 70s, and your hormones are raging. So at that age, I had made it my life's mission to try and get into the ashram, because we'd heard stories of wild orgies and all that, and I was this gawky, awkward Parsi kid from an all boys school. So I would take my cycle, and along with my cousin Ratan, who lived on such a post office,
Yeah.
we used to kind of cycle near the ashram, finding ways and means to kind of get in. And one day I remember that we saw the Bhagwan crossing the road, Rajneesh. And so I said, hey, Ratan, there's Osho. So I kind of cycled frantically, and I rushed up to him, and I kind of put my cycle on my stand, and I said, sir, we're very impressed with what you're saying and your teachings, so you want to come into the ashram, and you want to attend your lectures. So Rajneesh catches me by the ear and lands one slap on my face and says, "Bacha, cycle raste ke beech mein nahi park karte," and he walks off. And, and I think that probably led to my enlightenment. So I said, I've been slapped by Rajneesh. No?
Since you mentioned Rajneesh, that brings to mind another book I've written called I wanted to call it Prophet of Sex, but the publisher said no, call it Prophet of Love. So how it came about was I was in London, and the editor of the New Society, a prominent magazine at the time, called me and said, "Farrukh, you're from Pune, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, there's this ashram business started there. Lots of people are going there. Will you go there if I pay your airfare and write an article or two or three?" I said, "Sure." That sounded, good. He said, I said, I don't even care if he pays for the article as long as he pays my airfare. I went, turned up in Pune, and turned up at my Mausi's, my childhood place, my mother's sister, my Mausi's. I knocked at the door. They didn't expect me. They said, "What the hell are you doing here?" So I said, "We thought you were in London." I said, "No, I've come here for visiting the Rajneesh ashram." And they said, "Don't talk about the Rajneesh ashram. The price of eggs has gone up 10 times. We can't eat tomatoes nowadays because, these people." And Sheramasi said, "And they kiss in the streets." And I said, if I got the chance, I'd kiss in the streets. And they said, to London Jaina Bagri, you went to London and got ruined. And they said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "I'm doing it for a newspaper." And I called them and said, "I want to interview Rajneesh." And they said, "You can come to the ashram, but he doesn't do interviews. But turn up at 5:30 in the morning. You can listen to his lectures at 6. But don't use any aftershave or any soap when you have a shower. Have a bath before you come, a shower before you come. But don't use, because he has asthma and he can smell it from 200 yards. I said, "Okay." And they asked me all stupid questions. "Do you have any colds?" I said, "No." "Do you have any stomach trouble?" They probably wanted to know if I farted or something. So I said, "No, I'll do all that." I turned up on my bicycle, right? And I parked the bike and I went to his lecture. He came, all these bhakts were sitting there in their saffron costumes, and he in a shamyana, and he turned up in a car driven by a white girl in a driver's suit, in a chauffeur's white suit. He came 25 yards in a Rolls Royce, for God's sake. And he climbed on the platform, and they all stood up, ovation, this, that, and the other. And he spoke what to me, right? I don't know, I don't mean to insult anybody, but what to me was utter rubbish. He talked about this, that, and the other. And I thought, what a lot of nonsense. Went home, came back the next day for the lecture. As I left his lecture, same nonsense, but there was a girl outside, and the girl outside was distributing leaflets. And these leaflets, I picked up one, of course, and as soon as she distributed that, people came out of the ashram, grabbed her, pushed her into a car, and drove away. She protested, she fought, right? I looked at the leaflet. Excuse me if you can't take it, but it said, "You fucked me in my ear, you fucked me in my cunt, you fucked me in my ass, you fucked me in my eyes," all that. I thought, what the hell is this? I took my bicycle and went home, and towards home, there in the council house, which is a Pune government building, she was sitting under a tree. So I went up to her and said, "I read your leaflet," and she said, "Get away from me." I said, "No, I'm a journalist." She perked up, right? And I said, "Are you hungry?" And she said, "Yes, very." So I said, "Come on, I'll buy you a meal." So I turned up and we had bought her some breakfast, and she told me her story. She said she turned up there with her husband and her child, right? A 2-year-old child, daughter. And Rajneesh had then requisitioned her from the ashram buildings and said, "Come and live in my house," right? And he had used her for sex. And she said, "I got pregnant, and I said, I'm going to have God's baby." And the secretary, Ma Sheila, said, "No, you can't have God's baby, right? You have to have an abortion." And she said, "No, I'm not." And they got hold of her, they drugged her and aborted her. And then, of course, she left the ashram. The husband and child, she said, stayed in the ashram. And that's why she was living in the town and distributing these leaflets. And she was interested in me. And so that's the story that I've continued to write, because a lot of intrigue followed that. You want to know the rest of the story, read the damn book.
But it's
right?
called, after all this, it's called Prophet of Love.
It's called Prophet of
Prophet of
Love.
Love.
After all this.
After all this?
I'm saying after all that he did, the book is called Prophet of Love.
Prophet, yes, it's still called Prophet of Love. It goes right to the end. In the end, Murzban, I don't know whether she was telling the truth or telling lies, because she turned up at my house, right? Through lots of intrigues. There was a journalist friend of mine who used to write for the Times of India, and my aunts, when I got back that day, said, "Shodhan wants to see you. Whatever time you get back, get back." So I parked my bike and walked 200 yards to his house, right? And who should open the door but this girl? So what the hell are you doing here? And Shodhan comes after and says, "She's my partner now. She's staying here." And she latched onto him because he was a Times of India correspondent from Pune. Yeah, and she wanted the story written. So she was with him. And then she ran away from him. And because the police were looking for her, because she'd kidnapped her child. She'd kidnapped her child and brought her to my aunt's house and stayed in my room in the back. I persuaded my aunts to let her stay for a while. The police were looking for her because it wasn't her child. She'd kidnapped somebody else's child from the ashram and brought them in. So I didn't know whether she was crazy or what or which. And so in the end, there was an ambiguity about the story.
But Farrukh, with a destiny like yours, you're bound to be a writer, yeah?
So anyway, I've just got my first alert on the screen over there, so we'll sort of roll through the next of the questions. Yeah, sorry about that. Murzban, in fact, the next question is to you. It's about our city, Bombay, Mumbai. You started off with Breathless in Bombay, and now it's Muses over Mumbai. So obviously more than just a name change, so much has happened in the city. How do you, as a writer, navigate these rapidly shifting plates and still somehow continue to ensure that the soul of the Mumbaikar, the Bombay wala, is still intact? How are you able to do that?
So First, let's try and understand the changes. Let's just try and put some of the changes in perspective. I wrote Breathless. I completed Breathless in 2006, and so since then, and I had the reason I covered a lot of these migrant workers were that I had suspected that these trades were going to come under threat and these people were going to be marginalized. So the dhobis are having a tough time. The ghats are under threat from the builders. The Malishwalas have virtually been virtually extinct. There's only a sprinkling of them left now, and they ply on Marine Drive in the evenings because the beach has been taken over. So they've been evicted from there. The Victorias are banned, as we know. And a lot of these, also the fact that, there are almost green. So our green cover has been depleted because of the metro. There are 5,000 trees have been cut, which has driven up temperatures in the Fort region. Even as we are speaking right now, there are 6,000 building projects which have been commissioned. So all middle class neighborhoods are under threat. They are disappearing. So all these changes, obviously, they are very disturbing. And how do I navigate these sort of changes is with a whole lot of citizens' indignation, but writerly detachment. So let me explain what I mean by this is that I tend to separate uh, the soul of the city, the ethos of the city, which is its diversity, its bohemy, its empathy, this humanity, from the malified intentions of its caretakers. I tend to separate the two things totally.
And just to add to that, so your the protagonists in your writing, especially the short stories that are expected next month, I noticed that there is this dogged resilience, somehow sort of celebrating the spirit of Mumbai also. That's something that I've noticed throughout most of it. So is that also got to do with the fact that the city is changing rapidly, but somewhere we got to kind of keep our
Yes,
wits
this is
about
a
it?
city even after the terror attacks. Marine Drive had become like a graveyard. Today, if you see at 3 in the morning, there are couples celebrating, they're romancing. So this is a city which can literally rise from the ashes. We've seen that. And, it's kind of interesting because if you work outside your milieu, if you kind of write outside your milieu, and you also kind of write from events from your own life, it's interesting to see how these two things can coincide and how each kind of writing feeds the other. And this is a city which actually it raises your self-awareness and your self-worth.
Right, right. No, that's a lovely reply. In fact, Farrukh, there's one question that I had to put into, for the benefit of our readers here, our readers who are going to enjoy your book, is what was your initial reaction to the letters that relatives and descendants had sent to you that made you want to write Deccan Take Two, Deccan Queen Take Two?
Well, I didn't tell you this in our earlier correspondence, but I suppose I ought to blow it now. It's a confession. There was never a Deccan Queen Take One. What happens is Deccan Queen Take Two is called Deccan Queen Take Two because each of the short stories constituted, which are in Bombay and in Pune, has following the short story some objection or a letter from one of the characters in the story or somebody connected with the character in the story said, you SOB, you've uh, kind of libeled my uncle who was such an innocent guy and you told lies about him and blah, blah, and that sort of stuff. Other people seeking, Mr. Dhondy, I'm a writer, can you please help me write a book? And I read your short story, they said, it's all a pack of lies. I made it up. All the letters, all the confessions, all the correspondence behind each story is a conceit because I wanted the book to get the reader to ask what is the connection between reality and fiction. And since all of this is fiction, it was, I thought, a conceit that helped me write. I've never known a book in which the characters reply to the writer. or write about the story that they're supposed to be in, correcting the facts and saying this and that. After one of the stories, which about partition and how I came over with my sister when I was 2 years old, and it's followed by a letter from my uncle saying, uh, a real uncle, he didn't write the letter, I wrote it, uh, which says, uh, don't believe anything a word Farrukh says, it's all a pack of lies. He wasn't even born at partition. And he was, and all this sort of stuff correcting. So I've just confessed that it is not real, and that's why it's called Take Two. But maybe it should give the reader uh, uh, a question about what's fiction, what's reality, and what can be imagined and what's true.
So I'm told that we're totally out of time, but I can slip in one more question. Now, it's no coincidence that both these writers belong to the same community. Could you please tell us, both of you, very quickly, what is it that separates you all from the rest? Why are Parsi writers a breed apart?
Okay, so that's an
Right.
interesting question, Fiona. So let me tell you, there are a few traits which make us naturally qualified to be writers. First thing is the expense of sounding immodest. I can say honestly that when you're a Parsi, you can born a Parsi, you can presuppose a certain level of erudition. I mean, we've all grown up, with Shakespeare and Longfellow and Shaw and Wilde. I mean, I had a uncle who would thunder at me, Longfellow, his brow was wet with honest sweat. He earns whatever he can. He looks the whole world in the face, for he owes not any man. Or, even from Hamlet, to cursed spite that I was ever born to set it right. Now, when you have an upbringing like this, you have no option but to become an activist, which also lends itself very naturally to becoming a writer. You tend to take strong moral positions. I think the third quality would be that, Parsis have an OCD about cleanliness, tidiness. I mean, when I have guests at home, I'm always chasing them around with coasters saying, please don't put your glass on my, colonial, this thing. So I think that reflects in the way we write and we revise our work. It's like Flaubert's mother said, the pursuit of the perfect phrase desiccated his heart. So we tend to revise, over-revise. I think that's one of the qualities uh, of a Parsi writer.
And Farooq,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Well, the Parsi community, as you know, has contributed quite a lot to the history of India. For instance, the families that are now industrialists and very rich probably started as traders in the opium trade of Britain, selling opium to China. And they didn't actually sell the opium, the Brits owned the opium, but the Parsis supplied the trade. Uh, Certainly, the Tatars did started their uh, started their business that way, and they became the first capitalists, assisted, by the way, by my grandmother's family, the Saklatwalas, who were their cousin. And I did look up to see whether Gujarat had a village called Saklat, but it's not. They used to trade in jute from Bangladesh, and they were called the sackcloth walas. And that's why the name Saklat Wala came about. Anyway, uh, from becoming the first capitalists, they became the first uh, dynamic professionals. You know, the old joke: one Parsi, constitutional lawyer; two Parsis, gay couple in Kolaba; three Parsis, joint family meeting; four Parsis, what's it called? The State Bank annual picnic, right? So we were all induced by our families to become, as you said, professionals of one sort or the other. Either lawyers or engineers or doctors or this or that. And in the course of that, we rejected the professionalism. I didn't want to join the army. My father was an army man, right? I didn't want to be a chemical engineer, though I lived for a year studying chemical engineering in the Bombay University Department of Chemical Technology. I hated it. So, you run away and you want to do something else. And the time I spent at the BUDCT, right, I was traveling on the local buses from Grant Road, where I lived, to Matunga, where the BUDCT was. And I understood thermodynamics and whatnot. I liked science, but I didn't want to be a chemical engineer. And on the trains, I would read Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet. And so I thought to myself, if this guy can write about Alexandria, I can write about Bombay. And so that's how the inspiration to start writing came. And of course, we read a lot of literature, including a lot of rubbish also.
So I'll just add a little to this. So similarly, I was in advertising for a number of years, and then I quit because with advertising, you create illusions, whereas with writing, you break them. So the whole transition was from advertising to writing. Yeah.
Great. So some wonderful answers here from both of you. I'm going to open the floor to the audience for, we'll have time for, I think, just about 2 questions. Yeah. Any?
So we have someone in the third row.
Yeah, third row.
Can we get one mic from the stage, please? Thank you. Third row, please.
Hello. Congratulations. You both of Parsis. I would like to say Sahibji to both of you. And I just want one line from both of you. Mumbai special, if you can.
One line of Mumbai is special. Something that is a special to Mumbai.
Special to Mumbai. I think a line which I've used in my book saying it's a miracle of coexistence here. It's a miracle of coexistence.
The reason that I wrote Deccan Queen was because I could explore the contemporary stories, the stories from my childhood, and of course the stories of the building of Bombay and the foundation of the Deccan Queen, the engineers who made the railroad and whatnot. And it's not about the history of them, it's stories about them and stories about a young British girl in the 19th century who comes to Bombay to try and marry somebody here and so forth, a British Raj person. So it's history. Its history yields a lot of background for you to write stories about. That's what's special for me about the city here.
Anyone else with another question? We have someone right at the back, in the last row. Can someone please?
Hello. Hi. I actually had a question about, I think you spoke about Murzban. I think you spoke about writing outside your cultural milieu. I was wondering, how do you write outside your cultural milieu and feel empathy for people you've never actually, you've never lived their lives, you've never understood their background. And I've always worried that it feels like cultural slumming sometimes to me. So how do you write with empathy about a world that you've never really lived from within?
It's a very relevant question, and this is something I dealt with for a long period of time. So as I explained to you that, going and staying with tribals in the villages really sensitized me as to why they were pouring into the city. They didn't really want to be here. No one wants to build his house on a gutter or sleep his family on a bed of stone. So it's very important to understand where these people, when I'm doing my research, I don't like to call it research, like to call it a sensitization program. When I was doing that, I would be very, very sensitive to make sure that to where they were coming from and the fact that it was not about my writing, but about understanding their lives. Yeah. So I had a 2-pronged sort of formula there. One is I would take a leap of faith where the characters would trust me enough to develop their stories. And then I would take a leap of imagination where I fictionalize the issues so that I could bring forth their lives in a more emphatic way. Yeah. Okay. So it's about spending dedicated time and not rushing and trying to get your story down, but understanding where they were coming from and where they wanted to go with their lives.
Perfect.